All right, so this topic of discussion is all about like errors, okay? And now we're talking about like basically we've got all these different hypotheses flying around, and we're either rejecting or failing to reject, and sometimes we will make a mistake, okay? Or not really a mistake, but sometimes our data maybe be too close to call, and we just have to make a decision, and sometimes it's not right, okay? But first we got to talk about like what different kinds of errors there are before we can like talk about what we do with them. Okay, so let's start with like a little bit of analogy. Okay, say you're in a courtroom, you're on a jury, you've heard the arguments, and now you've gone back to deliberate, and you have to make a decision about guilty or not guilty. Okay, so there is two different sort of situations. We're looking at the truth. So this is what actually happened. Okay, so that is either the person is not guilty or guilty. Okay, and then the jury will make a decision of their own, whether it's guilty or not guilty. Okay, so what happens if the jury comes back with a guilty verdict, but in actuality and reality, the person was not guilty? Okay, well, if the jury says they're guilty, then let's see, an innocent person goes to jail. Okay, if the jury says guilty, but in actuality, in real life, they were not guilty, the innocent person goes to jail. Okay. What if the jury says guilty, but in reality, they were guilty? Well, that would be, a correct decision. Okay. And then same thing, if the jury decides not guilty and the actual truth was not guilty, that's another correct decision. And then we have our last situation. If the jury says not guilty, but the actual reality, the real deal is that the person was guilty, we end up with a guilty person going free. Okay? And what we're really worried about right now, especially how we're going to apply this to our class, is these two specific situations. Okay? And how they are both errors, but they end with a different result. Okay, we either have an innocent person going to jail or a guilty person going free. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is what would be considered the worst mistake. So think about it for a second. What do you think? We're going to have more of a discussion in class with this one, but just think, which one do you think is worse? Okay, well, some of you might be thinking, well, it sort of depends. Depends on the crime. You might think different crimes would, say it would be worse if an innocent person goes to jail, or another crime, it might be worse if the guilty person goes free. So again, it depends. And the same thing would work with like a company. Okay, if they're wanting to run tests and seeing how much money is being spent on certain things, they might worry about one error more than the other. Okay, so it all depends. Okay, so there's no one answer for this. Okay. All right. So again, bringing in the whole jury example about and how it sort of relates to what we're talking about. So a jury going to decide whether the defendant is guilty or not guilty. That's the same thing as us. So we will decide whether to reject or fail to reject the null hypothesis. Okay. And then also in a courtroom, they always start with the assumption that the defendant is innocent. So that's the same thing as us saying we always assume the claim or our null hypothesis is true. Okay. And then in an actual courtroom, the court presents evidence and a decision gets made. Okay. And so that is us doing our calculations, finding the p-value from sample data. Okay, so the same sort of kinds of errors can happen with our tests. Okay, so we're going to set up this chart the same exact way. Up here at the top, we have our fail to reject. Okay, and we have our reject, the null hypothesis. Okay, so fail to reject that null hypothesis and reject. Okay, so this means we are sticking with our null hypothesis, and this means we have evidence for our alternative. Okay. And then our decision, after we've run through the numbers and stuff, we can either reject the null hypothesis, which means we found evidence for our alternative, or we can fail to reject the null hypothesis, which again means we're sticking with the null. Okay. All right, so we have different types of errors. Okay, when we have when we decide that we should reject, okay, so this is our decision, we're going to reject when we should have failed to reject, okay, this is called a type 1 error. Okay, and this is mainly just like a memorization, like vocab sort of thing. Okay, so when you reject, when you should have failed to reject, then it's a type 1 error. Okay, and then moving down, if we fail to reject when we should have failed to reject, this is a correct decision. And this one has no special term, just correct decision. Good job. All right, now let's go to our other column. Okay, if we reject when we should have rejected, okay, we've talked about that, that's a correct decision. Okay, but this one has a special name. Okay, when you reject when you should have rejected, this is called power. Okay. And then our last situation, you might sort of guess what might be coming up. If you fail to reject when you should have rejected, this is the type 2 error. Okay, so I'm going to stop the video here, and then I come back with the next one.